There are tons of old baseball broadcasts on YouTube, but have you ever wondered where they come from? And have you ever wondered if anybody actually watches this stuff? Well, I can answer that second question right now. I watch old broadcasts. In fact, I've always watched old broadcasts. Well, this hobby of mine goes back to when I was a little kid. My dad had recorded a few old baseball games going back to Game 7 of the 1985 World Series. I was 1 year old at that time. I think we didn't actually own a VCR until about 1987. I'm pretty sure that my dad rented a VCR to make the older recordings. I spent a lot of time as a kid watching that 1985 World Series game, as well as the parts of the 1986 World Series Game 6 we had on tape. There were other games too. I can distinctly remember watching the 1991 World Series Game 7, a tape that I must have watched dozens of times. Now, it wasn't until I was in high school that I discovered that there were other weird people like me out there. This was back in the glory days of the internet. I discovered a website run by a guy who sold copies of old broadcasts he had in his collection on VHS. And that was the first time I realized just how much stuff is out there. Well, the first game I bought from him was the 5th game of the 1980 NLCS, which is an all-time classic. You have to watch it if you haven't. I followed that one up with Game 6 of the 1986 NLCS, another famous one. I then got a copy of Game 4 of the 1969 World Series. Now, the quality on the tape I bought was a lot worse than this version, and unfortunately I didn't hold on to that tape. But there was a problem. This guy was charging tons of money for copies of his stuff. I mean, he wanted $20 per tape, which, as it turns out, was a total ripoff. Okay, I need to explain something here. In the world of bootlegging, there is a code of ethics that applies. I'm not making this up. It makes sense if you're a fan of the Grateful Dead. The old Grateful Dead rules were that you couldn't sell copies of your tapes for a profit. Now, it's fine to charge to offset your costs. However, selling stuff that doesn't belong to you to make a profit really is not cool. Now, speaking of the Grateful Dead trading scene is a great example of what the internet does to these types of communities. Old Grateful Dead recordings are more plentiful, they're easier to access, and they come in higher remixed quality now than ever before. The same thing applies to old baseball broadcasts. Well, back in the early 2000s, the vast majority of baseball fans had no idea that any of this stuff was still out there. I was a heavy user of Baseball Primer back in those days. I remember guys on that site being surprised when I told them about all the old tapes I'd collected. And I had collected a lot. It was a real dark time in my life, actually. So back in early 2003, I was still a freshman at BYU. I was so depressed at that time, non-existent love life, that sort of thing, that I shut myself off from the outside world. I spent hours in my dorm room watching tapes of old games on an old portable Zenith black and white television. Yeah, you know there's something wrong with your life when you just spend 8 hours watching World Series games from the 1970s. So be careful with this hobby and don't let it consume you. Now, I had no idea at the time about just how big this hobby would become. It was around 2006 or so that I became active in the private torrent tracker community. Sports Scene was the big site back then, but there were a few others. Those sites are all gone now, however. YouTube has driven them out of business. And YouTube is really a blessing for those of us who just want to watch the old games. I mean, there's no need to worry about seeding, no need to worry about your ratio, you don't have to wait for the file to come, you don't have to worry about viruses, about bad torrents, about files that just don't work. None of that matters. Plus, you can talk in the comments about the old games with the other people who watch the broadcast. It's actually pretty cool. You can find all sorts of crazy stuff on YouTube, including some stuff I thought I would never see. I'm talking like old Japan series games. But where did these old broadcasts come from anyway? Well, you know as well as I do where most of the stuff from the 80s and 90s comes from. Home video recorders were extremely common, and a lot of old tapes have survived. The further back into the 80s and late 70s you go, the bigger the chance is that the original source was actually a Betamax tape. In fact, the first Betamax unit commercially sold in the United States came out in November 1975. But as many of you know, we've got stuff that predates November 1975. I mean, the 1975 World Series was in October, right? So how do we have that? Not only was the 1975 World Series broadcast in October, but the tapes that have survived are in incredible condition. There is a story here. 25 years ago or so, websites that talked about old sports broadcasts made a point of saying that the television networks just didn't save tapes of any of this stuff. Well, that was actually a lie, as it turns out. The truth is that the tapes you see of the 1975 World Series, the 1974 World Series, the 1969 World Series, and anything else from before 1976 in color comes from original network truck feeds. In fact, some of the old feeds don't cut to commercials during breaks. That is the telltale sign of an original network feed. And then there's the black and white world. As I understand, television networks used to make kinescope recordings of scripted dramas. These were made to allow affiliate stations in the West to broadcast the same episodes as those in the East. The old black and white broadcasts that survived were all kinescope recordings. And there are more of these out there than people admit. In fact, we've seen some really interesting releases that have come out just over the past couple of years, and I know for a fact that more is coming. Okay, you know which company I really dislike? Rare Sports Films. I hate this company. Why? Because they sell copies of old broadcasts for profit. The man who owns the company is probably the biggest figure in the collecting field. He's the guy who owned the 1956 World Series Game 5 reels, which weren't released to the public until the Major League Baseball Network finally broadcast the game a decade or so ago. He is also the guy who bought up Bing Crosby's old kinescope copy of the 7th game of the 1960 World Series. He has more in his collection. We know that he's got every game of the 1957 World Series and that he's got at least one game of the 1955 World Series, and maybe more. Now, I would love to watch these games, and I hate any collector who holds on to this stuff in hopes of making a profit. Now, here's the interesting part, and this is the speculative part. I was active on a trader forum around 2002. This was a crazy place. I remember there were guys on there who would collect every broadcast copy of every single game that Kobe Bryant had ever played in. So guys like that, back then. There was a post that I remember distinctly in which a collector claimed that there were uncirculated copies of a few very rare baseball games still in existence. These include, and I remember this, Game 7 of the 1960 World Series, Don Larsen's Perfect Game, which is the 56 World Series Game 5, and the Holy Grail, which was the third game of the 1951 Dodgers-Giants playoff. Rumor has it that a kinescope copy of the Bobby Thompson game existed at a museum of television in New York City for decades. I strongly suspect that Rare Sports Films owns this reel and that it will release it in the near future, once there's evidence of demand, of course. And I still find that a really shady business practice. Now, that brings me to the last question. Do people actually watch this stuff? Well, yeah, of course. I mean, I do. But not as much as you think. You see, most of us don't really have 4 hours to sit down and watch an old baseball game. In other words, this stuff is not really as commercially viable as some people would hope. Now, that's the thing about these old recordings. In my opinion, the biggest value that they provide is when they're used as clips for new projects. YouTube creators understand the concept of an evergreen video. These old broadcasts, by very definition, are not evergreen. Their value diminishes as soon as the event ends. Now, if you can take an old broadcast and use it to make a point in an evergreen video by talking about something interesting to people at any point in time, then it has value again. Now, here comes the real fun part. What old broadcast do I recommend checking out? Look for anything NBC broadcast between 1983 and 1989. That's when Vin Scully was doing play-by-play. Scully's broadcasts are worth their weight in gold. Also, if you haven't watched it before, you need to watch the 1975 World Series. Watch all 7 games in order. In my opinion, that was the pinnacle of baseball television directing. Well, and there you have it. Seriously, if you're a baseball fan, give this a try if you haven't already. You get a lot of insight into the way that the game is played. You'll get a lot of insight into differences and the lack of certain differences over time. You'll get a lot of insight as well into the way that it was once broadcast. You might not want to watch Fox anymore. I definitely don't. And you'll understand, and I think you'll appreciate the history of the game just a little bit more if you take a little bit of time out to watch the old tapes.